4 people were dead. 2 children were gone. And nobody had heard a sound. The call came in the early morning hours of May 16, 2005. Not from a witness. Not from a neighbor who had seen something strange. It came because a family had gone quiet, and the people who knew them couldn't reach them anymore. When officers arrived at the house on North Idaho Street in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, nothing about the outside told them what was waiting inside. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. An ordinary house on an ordinary street in a city where nothing like this was supposed to happen. Inside, they found 4 people dead. Brenda Groene. Her boyfriend Mark Mackenzie. 2 of her sons. The crime scene made one thing immediately clear: this was not an accident, and it was not impulsive. This was controlled, deliberate, and savage. But the detail that stopped every officer in that house was not the violence. It was the absence. 2 children who were supposed to be there weren't. Dylan Groene, age 9. Shasta Groene, age 8. No sign of where they had gone. No trace of a struggle on their part. Just gone. What law enforcement was standing in was not only a murder scene. It was the starting point of a race against time, and the clock had already been running for hours. The nature of the injuries removed any doubt immediately. This was not a domestic dispute that had escalated beyond control. The violence was deliberate. It was sustained. It was methodical. And 2 children who had been inside that house when the attack occurred were now missing. No signs of voluntary departure. No personal belongings taken. No indication they had fled on their own. What law enforcement was dealing with was no longer only a mass homicide. It was a suspected double child abduction. And the most urgent question in any abduction case was the one that could not yet be answered. Whether those children were still alive. 4 dead. 2 children missing. No witnesses. No motive. This case will stay with you. Backhand index pointing down like this video so the algorithm keeps these stories alive. Subscribe to Cold Case Chronicle and hit the bell so you never miss an investigation. Hashtag Cold Case Chronicle, hashtag True Crime, hashtag Justice for the Grunes. From the first hours, detectives noted something that would continue to define the investigation. Nothing had been stolen. Valuables remained exactly where the family had left them. There was no evidence of burglary. No sign that a thief had been interrupted. This was not a crime of opportunity that had spun into violence. It was targeted. The reason for that targeting was, at that stage, completely unknown. The forensic picture that emerged from the scene was deeply troubling. The attacker had entered the home at night and had remained there long enough to move through multiple rooms. This was not hurried. Not impulsive. There was control here. There was patience. And there was a willingness to use extreme force without hesitation. Investigators who had worked homicides for years later described the scene as among the most disturbing they had encountered. The level of violence went beyond what was necessary to subdue the victims. It was personal in its ferocity, even though, as would later become apparent, the killer had no personal connection to the family at all. The victims had been bound. That single detail told investigators a great deal in those first hours. Binding takes time. It requires the victims to be controlled before the violence begins. It means the attacker arrived prepared. He brought what he needed. He had thought through what he intended to do before he ever set foot inside that house. Officers documented each room methodically. The house was modest. A working family's home. Children's belongings were visible throughout, the ordinary detritus of a household raising young kids. Toys. Schoolbooks. Clothing. The kind of things that make a crime scene like this feel even heavier to the officers moving through it. They were not just processing evidence. They were walking through the last hours of 4 people's lives. The medical examiner's findings would later confirm what investigators suspected at the scene. All 4 victims had suffered blunt force trauma. The attack had been sustained and brutal. The timeline suggested it had occurred sometime during the night of May 15, meaning the family had been dead for several hours before anyone knew to call for help. That gap, the hours between the crime and the discovery, was one of the most difficult realities of the case. Dylan and Shasta had been taken in the darkness, and by the time anyone knew they were missing, the man who had them was already far from Coeur d'Alene. Within hours of the discovery, state and federal authorities had been contacted. The disappearance of 2 children following a quadruple homicide triggered statewide alerts and drew national attention almost immediately. Amber alerts were issued. Photographs of Dylan and Shasta were distributed across multiple states. Roadblocks went up in and around Coeur d'Alene. Nearby wooded areas were searched. Officers canvassed the surrounding streets, asking whether anyone had seen unfamiliar vehicles or individuals during the night or the early morning hours before the call came in. No one had heard a thing. That absence of witnesses would become one of the defining challenges of the entire case. The attacker had moved through a residential neighborhood, committed one of the worst crimes in the city's history, taken 2 children, and disappeared, all without a single person noticing. Investigators were forced to consider the possibility that the perpetrator was someone entirely unknown to the victims. Someone who could enter and leave without drawing attention. Someone the neighborhood had no reason to watch. Behind the scenes, detectives began building a timeline. Phone records were pulled. Vehicle movements were traced. Surveillance footage from nearby streets and businesses was reviewed. Nothing immediately stood out. The last confirmed contact the family had with the outside world placed the timeline of the attack firmly in the late evening hours of May 15. After that, the house had gone dark, and no one had noticed until it was far too late. To understand what happened to the Groene family, it is necessary to understand who they were. Brenda Groene was 40 years old. She was a mother raising her children in a city she knew well, in a neighborhood that felt safe to her, in a house that was home. Her relationship history was not unusual for a woman of her age. She had been through the end of a previous marriage and was building something new. The man she was building it with was Mark Mackenzie, 37 years old. He had moved into the home and become part of the household. By all accounts the arrangement was ordinary. Neighbors saw nothing unusual. No shouting. No disturbances. A family living its life. Brenda had several children. The oldest ones were teenagers. Slade Groene was 13. Along with another son, he was found among the dead. Dylan and Shasta were the youngest. 9 and 8 years old respectively. Old enough to understand something was wrong that night. Old enough to be terrified. Young enough that the man who took them believed he could control them entirely. The biological father of Dylan and Shasta was Steve Groene. He was not living in the house at the time of the murders. He would later become one of the most publicly visible faces of the case, a father desperately searching for his children while simultaneously grieving the deaths of their siblings and their mother. His position in this story was one of the most painful imaginable. Peripheral enough to have survived, close enough to feel every moment of what followed. Investigators interviewed neighbors on both sides of the street. Most described the family in neutral terms. They kept to themselves. There were occasional sounds typical of a house with children, but nothing that had prompted concern or complaints. School records showed that the children attended local schools. Teachers and administrators reported no warning signs from within or outside the home. No recent custody battles. No restraining orders. No stalking incidents. In many homicide cases involving families, detectives uncover a history of domestic conflict, financial stress, or escalating threats. In this case, none of those factors were immediately apparent. The family did not fit established risk profiles commonly associated with targeted violent attacks. There was no financial crime in the background. No organized criminal ties. No escalating threats that anyone around them had noticed. As part of the background investigation, detectives looked into whether the family had any indirect connections to individuals with criminal histories, former partners, acquaintances, extended family members. These checks produced no viable suspects. Every lead that pointed towards someone in the family's orbit eventually went cold. The physical layout of the home offered its own grim context. The house was accessible from the street. No security system. Standard doors and windows for a residence of its size and age. No barriers that would have made entry particularly difficult. North Idaho Street was not isolated. It was not far from main roads. Someone passing through the area could access it without difficulty. That detail would later take on significant meaning. The absence of a clear motive was the investigation's first major obstacle. There were no known enemies. No recent conflicts. No ongoing legal disputes. This led investigators to one of the most unsettling possibilities in violent crime. That the family had not been chosen because of who they were. That they had been chosen because of where they were. The conclusion investigators eventually reached was unsettling in its simplicity. There was nothing about the Groene family that explained why this had happened to them. They were not chosen because of who they were. They were chosen because they were available. Because the house was there, because the street was quiet, and because someone had been watching long enough to know when to move. As days passed with no suspect identified, the search for Dylan and Shasta Groene became one of the most widely covered missing child cases in the country. News networks picked up the story within 24 hours. The photographs of two young children, a boy and his little sister, smiling in the way children do when someone points a camera at them, became familiar to millions of people across the United States. Search efforts expanded beyond Idaho's borders almost immediately. The FBI took an active role in the investigation. Tips poured in from across the country. Each one was logged, assessed, and followed up on. Most led nowhere. Some took investigators briefly down paths that seemed promising before dissolving into dead ends. The sheer volume of information coming in was itself a challenge. Every hour spent chasing a false lead was an hour not spent finding the right one. Law enforcement also focused significant resources on the forensic evidence recovered from the scene. The attacker had been inside the house long enough to leave traces. Hair. Fibers. Biological material. The processing of that evidence was underway from the moment the scene was secured, but forensic analysis takes time. Results that might identify a suspect could take days or weeks to come back from the laboratory. And every day that passed was another day Dylan and Shasta were in the hands of whoever had taken them. Statistically, investigators knew what the passage of time meant in abduction cases. The likelihood of recovery diminishes sharply as hours become days. But the search continued with full intensity. Because the alternative, stopping, slowing down, accepting the worst, was not something anyone in that investigation was prepared to do. For the residents of Coeur d'Alene, the murders shattered something that could not be easily rebuilt. This was not a city accustomed to crimes of this scale. Parents kept children home from school. Community meetings were held. People who had never locked their doors at night began doing so. The sense that something had entered their city and taken from it, something predatory and cold, settled over the community like weather. Law enforcement faced mounting pressure to produce answers. Press conferences were held. Statements were carefully worded to avoid compromising the investigation while still offering the public enough information to feel that progress was being made. Behind the closed doors of the task force, however, the honest picture was a difficult one. There was no clear suspect. No clear motive. No clear direction. Just the faces of two children and the knowledge that somewhere, out there, someone had them. No motive. No witnesses. Two children in the hands of someone capable of this. If you're still following this case, drop a comment with, "I'm still here, so I know who's with me." Backhand index pointing down, and if you haven't subscribed yet, This is the moment. Cold Case Chronicle digs into cases that deserve to be remembered. Hashtag Cold Case Chronicle, hashtag True Crime Documentary, hashtag Dylan and Shasta. As the investigation widened, attention turned toward a specific category of offender. Individuals whose history suggested not only the capacity for extreme violence, but the willingness to act on it repeatedly, across state lines, without remorse. One name would eventually stand out above all others. Joseph Edward Duncan III. Duncan was born in 1959. From an early age, his life moved in a direction that those who would later study him described as almost textbook in its trajectory. A troubled childhood marked by instability, early exposure to dysfunction, and a developing interior world that those around him could not fully see. By the time he was a teenager, he had already begun acting on impulses that would define the rest of his life. At the age of 17, Duncan committed his first known sexual assault. The victim was a younger boy. Duncan was tried as an adult, convicted, and sentenced. He was released after serving time, and then he reoffended. This pattern, conviction, incarceration, release, reoffense, would repeat itself across the following decades, each cycle leaving behind more victims and a file that grew thicker with every passing year. His criminal history stretched back several decades by the time the Groene murders occurred. His record included multiple convictions related to sexual offenses against children and acts of violence demonstrating a clear willingness to use force and intimidation. He was known to law enforcement agencies in multiple states. His criminal behavior had begun early and escalated steadily over time. Previous offenses had resulted in periods of incarceration, but each release had been followed by continued movement across state lines. Duncan did not establish long-term residences. He traveled frequently, staying in temporary locations or living out of his vehicle. He had at various points maintained a blog, an online journal in which he wrote in cryptic, disturbing terms about his own psychology, his desires, and what he described as an ongoing war within himself. Law enforcement and researchers who later reviewed those writings found in them a portrait of a man who was aware of what he was and had constructed an elaborate internal narrative to justify it. He did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as someone in conflict. The distinction mattered to him. It did not change what he did. By the spring of 2005, Duncan was in serious legal trouble in Minnesota. He had been charged with molesting a 6-year-old boy and was out on bail that many in law enforcement later argued should never have been granted given his history. He had posted bail, cut off his ankle monitoring bracelet, and disappeared. A warrant had been issued for his arrest. But the machinery of interstate law enforcement coordination moved slowly, and Duncan moved quickly. He traveled west. Into Montana. Into Idaho. He was driving, camping, moving through the landscape of the Pacific Northwest with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years living on the margins of settled society. He selected locations that allowed him to blend in easily, places where his presence would attract no attention. Coeur d'Alene fit that profile precisely. Investigators would later piece together evidence suggesting that Duncan had been in the Coeur d'Alene area for some time before the night of May 15. That he had watched. That he had identified the house on North Idaho Street and the family inside it. That the attack on the Groene family was not a random act of violence committed by a man passing through. It was premeditated. It was surveilled. It was planned. His prior crimes revealed a consistent behavioral pattern. He targeted children. He used manipulation and deception before escalating to violence. He demonstrated planning, patience, and a near-total absence of remorse. Psychological evaluations conducted during earlier incarcerations had identified him as a high-risk offender with a strong likelihood of reoffending, particularly if he remained unsupervised. Despite those assessments, there were limited legal mechanisms available at the time to restrict his freedom of movement beyond standard parole conditions. The system had flagged him. The system had failed to hold him. For investigators reviewing his file, the question was not whether Duncan was capable of committing the crime. It was whether he could be placed in the right location at the right time. At this stage, he was not yet a named suspect. His name existed among thousands of others being cross-referenced by task forces across the region. What distinguished him was the combination of his history and his mobility. He was someone who could enter a community, act, and disappear without leaving obvious traces. There were no eyewitnesses placing Duncan near the Groene residence on the night of the murders. No vehicle description that matched one known to be associated with him. The forensic evidence collected at the scene had not yet been matched to any individual in law enforcement databases. The investigation had the evidence. It did not yet have the name to match it to. While investigators worked the files and the databases and the forensic timelines, Duncan was already moving. He was on public roads, crossing into new jurisdictions, traveling through states where officers had no idea who he was or what he had done. He was moving with the children. What Duncan did to Dylan and Shasta Groene during the weeks that followed would emerge in court proceedings and in the statements Shasta later gave to investigators. It is not necessary to detail every element of what occurred. What matters for the purposes of this investigation is the bare and terrible fact of it: 2 children were held captive by a violent predator for 46 days. They were taken into remote wilderness areas, into the mountains of Montana, into national forest land where the nearest road was miles away. Duncan had supplies. He had camping equipment. He had planned for an extended period of isolation. Dylan Groene did not survive. He was murdered by Duncan during those 46 days, at a campsite in the St. Joe National Forest in Montana. He was 9 years old. His remains were recovered shortly after Shasta was found, following information she provided to investigators. The discovery confirmed what those who knew the statistics of child abduction had feared from early in the case. That the window for saving both children had closed weeks before the investigation found its break. Shasta survived. The reasons for that, the specific calculus Duncan used in deciding to keep her alive while killing her brother, are among the most disturbing aspects of a case filled with disturbing aspects. What is clear is that Shasta demonstrated a resilience that investigators and psychologists who later worked with her described as extraordinary. She endured. She observed. She remembered. And when the moment came, she was present enough, and alive enough, to be recognized. Duncan, for his part, moved with the confidence of someone who believed he had escaped the reach of law enforcement entirely. He had done it before, gone underground, changed his patterns, stayed off the grid long enough for interest to fade. He had reason to believe he could do it again. He had been wrong about many things in his life. He was wrong about this too. On the night of July 2, 2005, 46 days after the murders on North Idaho Street, Joseph Edward Duncan III made a decision that ended everything he had built around his own escape. He drove to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur, the same city where he had committed the crime. He brought Shasta Groene with him. Whether this was arrogance, recklessness, or something else entirely, a subconscious pull toward exposure that some forensic psychologists have identified in long-term predatory offenders, is something that was debated long after the fact. What it was, in practical terms, was a fatal mistake. A waitress named Amber Den was working that night. She looked at the little girl sitting across from the man at her table and something registered. The face. The age. The way the child looked. Amber Den had seen the photographs of the missing Groene children. She had seen them the way everyone in northern Idaho had seen them, on flyers, on news broadcasts, on the screens that had been displaying those 2 faces for a month and a half. She looked again. She was certain. She did not panic. She did not confront Duncan directly. She went to the phone and called the police. Her composure in that moment, the decision to act quietly and quickly rather than in a way that might have caused Duncan to flee with Shasta, likely saved the child's life. Officers arrived within minutes. Joseph Edward Duncan III was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. Shasta Groene, 8 years old, 46 days after being taken from her home over the bodies of her family, was brought back into the arms of people who had been searching for her since the morning of May 16. She was alive. She was injured. She had survived things that no child should survive. But she was alive. The arrest sent an immediate shockwave through the investigation. Within hours, Duncan was identified as the primary suspect in the Groene family murders. The forensic evidence collected from the crime scene was matched against samples taken from Duncan following his arrest. The results were unambiguous. He had been inside that house. His DNA placed him at the scene beyond any reasonable doubt. In the days that followed, the full scope of what Duncan had done began to emerge. Investigators recovered evidence from his vehicle and from the campsite locations he had used during the 46 days he had been on the run. The picture that assembled itself from that evidence was one of methodical, calculated predation. Duncan had documented aspects of what he had done. He had kept materials. The evidence was overwhelming in both its volume and its horror. As investigators processed what they had found, a secondary and equally disturbing line of inquiry opened. Was the Groene family Duncan's only victims? Or had there been others? The answer came quickly, and it was not the one anyone had hoped for. In 2005, the same year as the Groene murders, investigators in Montana connected Duncan to the disappearance and murder of a 10-year-old boy named Anthony Martinez, who had gone missing in California in 1997. Duncan had committed that crime 8 years earlier, and in the years between, he had continued to move, to offend, and to evade the full consequences of what he was doing. The Groene case was not an isolated event. It was the most visible point on a line that stretched back decades. Investigators also examined Duncan's blog, which he had maintained under a pseudonym in the period leading up to the murders. The entries were rambling, sometimes philosophical, sometimes explicit. He wrote about what he called the battle between his good side and what he referred to as his demon. He described fantasies. He described planning. He described, in terms that were oblique enough to avoid immediate legal action but clear enough in retrospect, exactly the kind of person he was and what he intended to do. The blog had been publicly accessible. Law enforcement agencies who later reviewed it acknowledged that had the right eyes seen it at the right time, the analysis might have flagged Duncan as an imminent threat. Those eyes did not see it in time. The case forced a reckoning within the American system of sex offender monitoring and interstate law enforcement coordination. Duncan had been a registered sex offender who violated his registration requirements repeatedly and moved freely across state lines doing so. The mechanisms designed to track and flag offenders like him had failed at multiple points. He had been arrested in Minnesota on new charges, released on bail he should not have been granted, and then disappeared, and the alert generated by that disappearance had not reached the agencies that needed it before he struck in Idaho. Legislators, advocates, and law enforcement officials in the aftermath of the Duncan case pushed for reforms to the National Sex Offender Registry, tighter bail restrictions for high-risk offenders, and better coordination between state and federal databases. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, signed into law in 2006, was partly a response to cases like Duncan's, the kind of case that exposed exactly how badly the existing system could fail. Joseph Edward Duncan III was charged at both the state and federal level. The federal charges related specifically to the kidnapping and murder of Dylan Groene, the crossing of state lines in the commission of the crime, and related offenses. The state charges in Idaho addressed the murders of Brenda Groene, Mark McKenzie, Slade Groene, and the other son killed in the house on North Idaho Street. Duncan's legal proceedings were complex and extended across several years. He initially attempted to represent himself, a decision that resulted in lengthy procedural complications and delays. He made statements that contradicted themselves. He expressed, at various points, something that looked like remorse, and then undermined it in the next breath with statements that suggested he viewed his victims primarily as instruments of his own psychology rather than as human beings whose lives he had destroyed. In the federal case, Duncan ultimately pleaded guilty to the kidnapping and murder of Dylan Groene and related charges. In August of 2008, a federal jury sentenced him to death. The sentence was a first in Idaho federal court history, the first time a federal death sentence had been handed down in the state. The Idaho state case proceeded separately. Duncan was also convicted of the murders of Brenda Groene, Mark Mackenzie, and the 2 sons killed in the house. He received multiple consecutive life sentences for those crimes, to be served in the event the federal death sentence was ever vacated. Throughout the proceedings, Shasta Groene's testimony was central. She had been 8 years old when she was taken. She was 9 when she testified. Her account of what she had witnessed and endured was delivered with a clarity that left the courtroom silent. She described what had happened in the house on the night of May 15. She described what had happened to her brother. She described the 46 days she had spent as Duncan's captive. The details she provided were consistent with the physical evidence. Her testimony was devastating in its precision. Steve Groene, the father of Dylan and Shasta, addressed the court during the sentencing phase. His statement was one of the most quietly devastating things heard in that courtroom, a father who had lost 2 sons and the mother of his children, who had nearly lost his daughter, and who now stood in front of the man responsible and tried to find words adequate to the weight of it. There are no such words. He used the ones available to him. They were enough. The years between Duncan's sentencing and his execution were long. Appeals were filed. Legal processes ran their course. The federal death penalty machinery moves slowly by design, a product of its own requirement to be certain before it is final. Duncan spent those years on federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He continued to speak. He gave interviews. He wrote. He maintained the posture of someone who was engaged in deep philosophical inquiry about his own nature, someone who had done terrible things and was now thinking carefully about why. Those who had lost people to him received little comfort from his reflections. On July 27, 2021, Joseph Edward Duncan III was executed by lethal injection at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was 62 years old. He was the first federal inmate executed during the Biden administration, his execution having been scheduled during the final days of the prior administration and carried out before the new administration's moratorium on federal executions took effect. He made a final statement. He expressed what he characterized as love for humanity. He did not name his victims. Those who had followed the case for 16 years noted the omission. His death closed the legal chapter of a case that had opened on the night of May 15, 2005, in a quiet residential neighborhood in northern Idaho. 16 years from crime to execution. 46 days from abduction to the moment a waitress recognized a little girl's face in a Denny's restaurant and picked up the phone. Shasta Groene grew up. She has spoken publicly at various points about her experience, about what she endured, and about the life she has tried to build in its aftermath. Her survival is the one thing in this case that did not go wrong, the single thread of the story that did not end in loss. It is not a small thing. It is, in the context of everything else, extraordinary. The Groene case left marks on the community of Coeur that did not fully fade. The house on North Idaho Street still stands. The street still looks, from the outside, like what it was, an ordinary residential block in a northern Idaho city. The violence that occurred inside one of those houses in the early hours of May 16, 2005, is not visible from the street. It never was. That was partly what made it possible. The case also left marks on the American legal system. The failures that allowed Duncan to remain free, to skip bail, to move across state lines undetected, and to reach a family in Coeur d'Alene before anyone could stop him, those failures were documented, analyzed, and in some cases addressed through legislation. Whether the changes made were sufficient is a question that advocates for child safety have continued to debate in the years since. What is not debated is that the system as it existed in 2005 was not adequate to stop Joseph Edward Duncan III. For the investigators who worked the case, the officers who processed that crime scene on the morning of May 16, the detectives who built the timeline, the federal agents who assembled the evidence, the resolution brought what resolutions in cases like this usually bring. Not satisfaction. Not closure. Something smaller and harder to name. The knowledge that the work was done. That the person responsible was identified, convicted, and ultimately executed. That Shasta Groene is alive. That Dylan Groene, Brenda Groene, Mark Mackenzie, Slade Groene, and the other son lost that night, their names are part of the record. Their lives are part of the record. That is what this investigation produced. Not an ending that feels complete. There is no such ending in a case like this. But a record. A documented truth. The name of the man who did it. And the names of the people he did it to. Brenda Groene. Mark Mackenzie. Slade Groene. Dylan Groene. Remember them. Shasta Groene survived. Her brother Dylan did not. The full story of what she endured, and how she rebuilt her life, is one of the most harrowing survivals in modern true crime history. If this case matters to you, like this video and share it so more people know the Groene family's names. Subscribe to Cold Case Chronicle. These stories deserve to be told. #ColdCaseChronicle #Shasta Groene #Never Forgotten